I wanted to talk about the topic of plant-based meats. I don't know how many others are discussing this topic during this event. It's an area where I've published some literature, and I think there are a lot of questions about it. So my plan for today is to spend about half the time going through this presentation, and then the latter half taking your questions, and we can branch outside of this topic if we need to for that as well. So if I just scroll ahead, I think an introduction was already given, and it's always nice to share this photo of me and one of the dairy rescues at the animal sanctuary that I volunteer at. So I know people like to see that. And then a few other th details. I am a scientific reviewer, or was a scientific reviewer for The Proof is in the Plants by Simon Hill, the book from Simon there. I've contributed to a couple textbooks on the topic, very recently, the Handbook of Public Health Nutrition, and I'm currently advising on the Game Changers 2 documentary that is in the works. Now, today, the topics that I'm planning to cover are one, just some of the really common concerns about plant-based meat alternatives. And during that portion, I am going to take a little bit of a poll of you guys in the audience as well. So there'll be a little bit of participation there. I want to talk about the nutritional composition or nutritional content of plant-based meats. I want to talk about the research on plant-based meats and heart health, and this is where we really have the most research at this point. I want to, discuss whether there really are conflicting results, as some relatively recent headlines have suggested. There's a little bit of research on cancer that we're going to look at, and there's a little bit of research on bone health as well. And we'll finish with just a couple slides about the environmental impact to kind of cap off the presentation. So these are some of the headlines that I'm referring to, and these came out just last summer, in June. You see top left here, vegan fake meats. They always call them fake meats, of course. Increased risk of heart deaths. Vegan processed foods, ultra-processed vegan foods, and then they typically highlight, as we see in this bottom article, meat alternatives specifically. So later on in this presentation, I'm actually going to go over the study that spawned these headlines. But I just want to put it out there that this is something uh, that is a very prevalent narrative across the media and especially on social media as well. So something that we'll see quite often on social media is just an image like this or some variation of this where they'll show a beef burger and they'll say the only ingredient is beef. And oftentimes the only ingredient is grass-fed beef, as if that's the typical version. Um, Now, sometimes they'll include a bean burger, kind of a homemade bean burger. You have things like black beans, quinoa, onion, flax seeds, and so on, and relatively wholesome, at least on first inspection there. And then they'll show something like a Beyond Burger or Impossible Burger. And in this case, they have whoops, I'm going to go back for a second, the older iteration of the Beyond Burger. So you'll see like pea protein isolates, canola oils, coconut oil, and then down the list you get different names like succinic acid, acetic acid, ascorbic acid, methyl cellulose, and so on. And so you have a couple concerns that are typically raised there. One concern is that, well, there's a lot of ingredients, and there's this belief that having a lot of ingredients means that it is less healthy. That might generally be the case for ultra-processed foods, but it's not necessarily the case, and we'll touch on why. And then the second part of that is more so concern over those more like chemical names that are in that ingredients list, and we'll touch on that as well. So first, let's go over these concerns around the number of ingredients. I think we can, or at least most of us can agree here, maybe all of us, that a steak being, say, one ingredient is less healthy than a salad that we load up with 15 plus ingredients. And so just based on that alone, the number of ingredients isn't necessarily of concern. And in fact, something with more diversity could potentially be better. However, the pushback on that is typically that, well, if we go back to this and we see the types of ingredients, there might be some names in there, especially some of these chemical names that are more of concern. So I want to address some of the concerns over chemicals, and I want to poll you guys. So I'm actually going to pop open the chat as we go here. Um, let's see. Actually, somebody made a good point there too. We never usually in those lists, ingredients lists for the beef, we don't include what has gone into the cow as well, and that's a good point. But I want to poll you guys. So maybe actually instead of the chat, I'll do the hands. So if you can raise a hand, if you would consume dihydrogen monoxide. And I'll just give you guys a second to see who's raising their hands, if anybody. Um, I'm not seeing much. It seems like most of you would not, if I'm not mistaken. No, no, no. Everyone's saying no in the chat. Guess what? That is water. I should hope that you all consume that. Right? So a lot of these foods, or a lot of these ingredients, they have their common name and then they have their chemical name. And oftentimes in ingredients list, we will see the chemical names. So yeah, a bit of a trick question there. Now let's move on to this one. Who would consume alpha-linolenic acid? Again, let's see if there's a show of hands, or you can type a no or a yes in the chat. Um, Either way works. I'm just gonna give you guys a minute or so. Okay, we're having more people saying no. We're getting some people saying yes. I'm getting some hands raised. Okay, we're getting a little bit more of a mixed message here. Okay, let's do the reveal. It's the omega-3 fat, the primary omega-3 fat in things like flax seeds, walnuts, chia seeds, hemp seeds, soy. So again, and it's actually essential. We need to consume some in our diet, or at least some type of omega-3 in our diet. I should hope that, that most of you, if not all of you, do consume this. So again, it's just to illustrate that that just because something is a chemical name, or something is provided in its chemical name, doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad for us. Now, we're going to get a little crazier here. This is a chemical composition of some food listed as an ingredients list. Who would consume that concoction? Let's go through this one more time here, or actually two more. I got one more after this. But let's see a show of hands again, or again, you can just throw in the chat whether it's a yes or no. I'm getting some no's. Give you all a minute again. Someone's saying, I've seen this before. It's a yes. Okay. Um, let's uh, let's do the reveal. Strawberries. So if you were to break down strawberries into its chemical constituents, at least the known chemical constituents, these are all in there. A lot of these, if we just go through really quick, I have to move my screen around a little bit so I can see it properly. Aqua is water. You have different types of sugars. Of course, there are sugars in fruits. Fiber, yes, there's of course fiber in there. If we go down to fatty acids, you have the different types of omega-6, omega-3 fats, and so on. And their names are quite lengthy. You have things like decadienoic acid, and on and on. You have all the amino acids, things like aspartic acid, glutamic acid, leucine, alanine, lysine. Um, Whoops. Oh, I think I spoiled one there. And the list goes on and on. And then I wanted to finish up with one more here. Who would consume this? And I think I gave away a spoiler there, but we'll see anyway. Final one. Okay, I'm getting some no's. I think people saw this when I showed it there. Nope. No, seen it. Yeah, that was too bad. Usually I get people with this one, especially if I'm speaking to a plant-based group, because um, you just don't eat eggs anyway. But this is, again, just to show that um, if you were to break down pretty much any food into its chemical constituents, they can look, quite frightening, and in the way that these chemical names are written out. And so if we go back to this for a second, when we look at these, you have the pea protein, not a big deal. You have certain oils. They've actually switched this now with the latest iteration of the Beyond Burger. It's avocado oil. And I know there's debate over the oils, and we can talk about those maybe during Q&A. But you have, yeah, a little bit of salt, of course. Succinic acid and acetic acid are just naturally found in foods. Like acetic acid is the primary component of vinegar. Um, you have like cellulose, methyl cellulose, those are fibers. You have things like ascorbic acid, that's just vitamin C. So for a lot of these names, they might sound a bit scarier, but at the end of the day, a lot of them are things that you're getting from other sources anyway, or you're getting similar compounds from other sources anyway. And that's not to say that these plant-based meats are healthy or unhealthy. I'm not making that judgment yet, and we'll go over some of the research. But what I want to really highlight is that what's most important here is what does the research say about the package? When we actually look at consumption of the package, when people consume plant-based meats, do they lead to better outcomes? Do they lead to worse outcomes? Is it pretty neutral? What are you comparing it to? Like these are the questions that we have to ask. Not so much, hey, does it contain some amount of X ingredient that I can't pronounce? Does that mean that it's bad? Not necessarily. So then the third sort of thing that we need to touch on. So we touched on number of ingredients, we touched on chemical names. Now we need to touch on whether or not we need to be concerned about plant-based meats simply because they are classified as ultra-processed foods. Um, Now, I suspect that a lot of people here, and it's not just in this group, this is very common sort of across the nutrition space. A lot of people aren't really familiar with what an ultra processed food is, like how that is defined or what processes they go through. And so I just want to highlight what the different classifications are. So first, these foods are typically classified according to the NOVA system, and they classify unprocessed and minimally processed foods into one group, just group one. And these are things like meat, dairy, and on the animal side, and then on the plant side, things like fruits and vegetables. Now, I know in this image there is actually a little bit of bread and a muffin there. So those actually technically wouldn't fit into this category, but the rest of the things you're seeing here would be classified as either unprocessed or minimally processed. Then we have group two, which are processed culinary ingredients. So these would typically be things that are derived from those whole foods. So things like oils, sugar, salt. Um, those are things that you're adding to foods typically. And then you have group three, which are processed foods. And these are created by adding those culinary ingredients to the whole or minimally processed foods. So even if you can vegetables, and because they're typically suspended in a saltwater solution, they are now processed foods, even though nothing else has really been done to them. You can have canned fish, that would be a processed food. And then even like whole wheat breads and things can be classified as processed food. There's a little bit of nuance to that, which we'll get to in a moment, but just to show you the sort of variety that you can have here. And then finally, when we get to ultra processed foods or group four foods, these are basically foods that have been created um, through adding ingredients via an industrial process. So, um, these can be a range of foods from sodas to processed meats to plant-based milks, and to, again, breads, even whole wheat breads. So, how can breads in particular be classified into ultra-processed or processed foods? Like how do they, end up in both cases? Well, actually, you can have a bread made with pretty much the identical ingredients that you would otherwise pick up from a store, but if it's made in a home or in a local bakery or something like that, it could be classified as a processed food. Whereas if it goes through that sort of industrial processing and packaging and everything, it could then be classified as an ultra processed food, even though it's essentially the same food. And this is why there has been actually some pushback against just the blanket labeling of ultra processed foods because they are all created different. Obviously, a soda isn't the same as a plant milk, and a sausage isn't the same as a whole wheat slice of bread. They're very, very different. And what's really nice is recently, over the last, I'd say 5 or so years, we've had studies that actually separate out the different types of ultra processed foods. So, for example, you might have a study where ultra processed food consumption as a whole is associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and some types of cancers. But when you break it down further and look at different types of ultra processed foods, it's usually the sugary beverages like your Coca-Colas and Pepsis and whatnot, and your processed meats like sausages and bacon and so on that are the main offenders. They're the ones that are most strongly associated with risks. And a lot of other foods are kind of in the middle. And then you have some foods like whole wheat breads, for example, or whole grain pastas or whole grain cereals. Those end up actually being associated with a lower risk, so they're protective. So we can't just say that, hey, the whole wheat bread is bad for us because it's ultra processed. No, it could actually be beneficial. It's just that there are other ultra processed foods that are quite harmful if consumed regularly. And so the question, at least with this presentation, is where on that spectrum do the plant-based meats lie? Are they closer to the whole wheat products like the breads and whatnot? Are they closer to the sausages and whatnot on the, the more harmful side, or are they somewhere in the middle? And so that's what we're going to try to tease out as best we can based on the limited data thus far. So first off, let's look at the nutritional composition of plant-based meats. So that's important, right? Are they high in nutrients that are generally not so good for us, or are they high in beneficial nutrients or low in other nutrients? That's sort of where I would start. And especially looking at things like saturated fat and fiber and whatnot, because we know that those impact heart health. And the nutritional composition actually varies a lot between products. You can have two plant-based meats that are very, very different. And so that's something to really consider when we're choosing, plant-based meats if you are choosing to consume some. And I will go over some of the tips around choosing healthier products. But we can look at just common themes, like on average, what do we see with plant-based meats? And my colleagues and I actually published this paper in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology last July, where we reviewed the available research on the topic. And so I want to touch on the first sort of two-thirds of this now, and we'll get to the latter third in a bit. But we see that plant-based meats, they generally rely on one of four protein sources. So soy protein, like the Impossible Burger, for example, pea protein, which is what Beyond typically uses, mycoprotein, which is a fungal-derived protein, very similar to what you would get out of like a mushroom. But that's isolated, and that's really found in what are called corn products. You may have seen those on the shelf, QUORN. They're like a plant-based meat alternative using mycoprotein. And then vital wheat gluten, which is the primary ingredient in seitan, so a wheat-based protein. So those are the four most common protein sources. And then for the fat sources, the most common ones are either vegetable oils, so things like canola, sunflower, etc., olive oil, or coconut oil. And of course, coconut oil would be very rich in saturated fats, where those other options would be much lower in saturated fats. But on average, if we compare plant-based meats to the meat alternative, so if you compare plant-based sausages to animal-based sausages or plant-based burgers to animal-based burgers, we generally see that the plant-based meats are lower in saturated fat, lower in cholesterol, obviously because cholesterol is only found in animal foods, higher in fiber, again, because fiber is only found in plant-based foods. A bit higher in carbohydrates as well, again, because actually not all, but most animal foods are very low. And then lower in calories based on some of the studies, lower in monounsaturated fats, and then higher in those heart-healthy polyunsaturated fats. So with those findings, we're generally seeing a profile that is more heart-healthy than you would get from meat. However, the protein content and the sodium content was all over the map. In some studies, they found that plant-based meats were higher in protein or sodium. Other studies, they were lower in both, or vice versa. We need to look at the individual products to really draw conclusions around, is one product higher in protein than another? Now, I did make up this table using a few different products just to kind of highlight some of the big differences. So we have on the left side a Beyond Burger, we have in the middle an Impossible Burger, and then on the right side a Dr. Prager's burger. And we see that the calories per burger patty are very similar. Oh, and I also want to highlight actually the Beyond, this is the newest version of the Beyond Burger. I don't know if it's launched in other countries yet, but it's definitely in the United States. I'm in Canada, so it hasn't come up here yet, but I think it will shortly. Um, so we have similar calorie content between the three, pretty similar fat content, slightly more in the Beyond Burger, but lower saturated fat than the Impossible Burger, with Dr. Prager's being the lowest. So the saturated fat content is one that I would really look at here and opt for a product with lower saturated fat if I were to consume it regularly. We didn't have poly and monounsaturated fat information for these two burgers, so I couldn't really do a comparison there. For protein, all pretty similar. Yeah, the Beyond Burger just edges it out a little bit, but overall pretty similar. The fiber varies a decent amount, from 2 to 5 grams between Beyond and Impossible. Sugar content basically zero across the board, at least as far as like added sugars. Oops. And then for calcium content, you see that Impossible comes out on top. Dr. Prager's is the lowest. For iron, Impossible and Dr. Prager's are very similar, whereas the Beyond's a bit lower. Potassium, a huge variability, and higher potassium is generally better. But yeah, massive variability there. And then for sodium, the Beyond Burger was the lowest. So you see some pros and cons to sort of each version. But one of the underappreciated aspects of these plant-based meats, or I would say processed foods in general, is that we can reformulate them. We can change the composition, the ingredients. It's not like a cow where you can't just reformulate them overnight. There's a lot of time and everything that goes into the selective breeding, and that's usually more so around yield and taste and whatnot, not so much the nutrition content. Whereas with these plant-based meats, we can try different recipes and see what works better and try to lower the saturated fat, increase the protein and all of that. And we see that between the old and new Beyond Burger, slight reduction in calories, slight reduction in fat, but a pretty significant reduction in saturated fat. That's excellent. We see a pretty substantial increase in calcium content, also excellent. We see that actually iron did go down a little bit. That's like the one negative, perhaps. But then sodium went down as well. So this is really good to see. And we can hopefully see in the future even further refinements to make them healthier, as long as they can obviously maintain the taste and texture that they're aiming for. Now, with some of the discussion about protein, I do want to veer off from plant-based meats a little bit before we get into the research on plant-based meats and the actual, health outcomes or results based on the available trials. So I just want to touch on the concerns potentially over plant proteins and do they match up to animal proteins. So I want to start by saying that one of the concerns is that plant proteins are not complete, that they're missing some of the essential amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein that we need to consume in our diet. But that is a myth. All plants contain all of the essential amino acids, all nine of them, but in varying amounts. So some might have more of certain amino acids, less of others, and vice versa, but they do contain all of them. And funny enough, collagen or its derivative gelatin, which are animal products, are the only incomplete protein I'm aware of where they're completely lacking one of the essential amino acids, and that's tryptophan. So a bit of irony there. It's also important to note that we do maintain pools of amino acids in our bloodstream and in our body. So you're constantly combining proteins throughout the day. You'll combine proteins from breakfast with lunch and then with dinner. You don't need to worry about having certain types of foods mixed together at each meal or a variety. Your body will take care of it as long as you're getting enough of all of those amino acids and that protein in your whole day. Now, the second concern that gets brought up is that we don't absorb protein from animal sources as well, or at least that's the claim, or sorry, from plant sources as well, and that's the claim that animal sources are superior. And this is typically based on one of two protein digestibility scoring systems. And I'm not going to bore you too much with the intricacies of how these are done, but I just want to touch on briefly what they're measuring and why there are some issues with them. So they primarily use the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score or the digestible indispensable amino acid score, so the PDCAAS or the DIAS. Actually, I'll describe them first before I move on to issues. So just briefly, what they do is they will feed foods to an animal, typically a rodent, with the PDCAAS, the first scoring system. They'll measure how much protein goes in and how much comes out the other end, and that difference is presumably what was absorbed by the rodent. And then, of course, they extrapolate that to humans. Now, there are some issues with that, as we can touch on here. For one, it's predominantly tested in rodents. We aren't rodents. I think that should hopefully go without saying. Two, they're typically only measuring individual foods, so not a meal where you're mixing foods or even a whole day's worth of eating where you're eating different foods. And that's especially a problem because they don't just measure protein digestibility. They measure the limiting amino acid or the amino acid that is present in the lowest amount. So for example, if you had a protein that provides very high amounts of 8 of the essential amino acids, but only about half of your needs for one of the amino acids, your maximum score would be a 50% because you only have half of that one amino acid there. It doesn't even care about the rest of the amino acids being present in higher amounts. So to give you an analogy here, this would be like, seeing a report card from school and getting straight A's across 8 of 9 subjects, and then on one of the subjects you got a C. And then, let's say they provide kind of your average score. It wouldn't be an average in this case, but they provide kind of like an overall score and they say you got a C. Well, clearly that's ridiculous. You got basically straight A's and one C, but they would just give you whatever the lowest score is. And that's how these systems work and how they bias the results against plant foods, because plant foods do have higher amounts of certain ones and lower amounts of others, which it completely just doesn't matter if you're eating a variety in your day. And then another issue with the PDCAS is that they measure digestion through the whole digestive tract, and there's some microbes and bacteria in the colon near the end of the intestines where they'll chew up some of the protein, so it could be a little bit misleading. Now, the DIAS is a little bit different. They tested in pigs, but once again, we are not pigs. We are humans. Our growth is different. Our protein needs are different to a degree. And once again, they're only measuring single foods, and they have the same issue where they dock points if you don't have 100% of all of the amino acids there. And another issue is they predominantly use raw foods. So even grains and beans, they'll feed raw beans or raw grains to the animal. And we just don't, we break them down a lot better once they're cooked. So that's a bit misleading as well. Unfortunately, we actually have some human research where they're looking at the digestion of the whole protein in people, and that's obviously going to be a bit more relevant to us than research on rodents or pigs. And we see that the true ileal digestibility, so right here, if you can see my cursor, that's what we're looking at. We see that the digestibility of things like soy protein or pea protein, they're in the 90s, 91.5% roughly. Wheat gluten also just above 90%. Lupin, rapeseed, like they're all pretty high, around 90% or higher, with the rapeseed protein being a little bit lower. And even if we look at the highest animal foods, we're seeing milk protein at 95%, we're seeing casein at 94.1%. We're talking about a few percent difference in digestibility. This is nothing to really worry about. It's an absolutely tiny difference that could easily be overcome by just consuming, a tiny bit more. It's really not an issue at all. Also, there is simply no good evidence that widespread protein deficiency in plant eaters in Western populations. And actually, in some populations, vegans may consume even more protein per body weight than non-vegetarians because the vegans tend to weigh less. So the amount of protein they need for their body weight is less. And so that's sort of an interesting comparison there. And we also have randomized controlled trials where they'll take people, they'll split them in half get the plant protein like a rice or a soy or a pea protein, and then half get the typically whey protein, which is animal based, and they'll have them lift weights and they'll measure how much muscle they gain, how much strength they gain over the course of weeks or months, and it's about the same. We don't see any significant differences or strength or size between the two, and so that shows us that both the plant and animal foods or animal proteins, they're working just as well. Um, Now, some people will push back on that and say, well, if you're using protein supplements, they're because they're extracted and a lot of the fiber and everything has been removed, that it's not super accurate. Well, we actually have some, or it's not relevant rather to whole food sources or actual food source of protein. Well, we actually have some research looking at that. There was a trial published in 2021 by researchers out of Brazil where they had 19 vegans and 19 meat eaters. They had both of them up their protein intake to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. So if you're wondering what that would be for you, you take your weight in kilograms and you just times it by 1.6, and that will give you the number of grams per day here. Um, and for the vegans to do that, they added soy protein. For the meat eaters to do that, they added whey protein, and they resistance trained 2 times a week for 12 weeks. Now, one really important takeaway here is that yes, they added some protein supplementation, but in both groups, the majority of their protein came from foods. So if it is true that plant foods are inferior for protein or that it doesn't do much, well, then we should see the animal protein group do better. But we didn't. We saw similar outcomes after 12 weeks of resistance training between both the meat eaters and vegans. And so this really does suggest that there isn't a meaningful difference between them. They can both get the job done when it comes to strength gains and muscle gains. And in fact, the plant protein sources tend to be much healthier. And then finally, we have another trial that came out a little bit later in 2023. And this took 22 participants who were placed on either a plant-based diet or omnivorous diet. Um, and they aimed to consume 2 grams of protein per kilogram per day, which was actually a little bit higher than the other trial, but that was only because they wanted to make sure that if people fell short, that they still got enough. So it's a bit of a safety net. And for the plant protein group or the plant-based group, the primary source of protein was the mycoprotein. So I discussed that earlier, that sort of not exactly mushroom, but sort of mushroom derived protein. And they also supplemented everybody, both the meat eaters and the vegans, with creatine, which can help bolster performance. And they resistance trained 5 times a week for 10 weeks, so a much more rigorous resistance training program. And at the end of the day, both groups saw similar improvements in lean mass and performance. So again, showing that both the plant protein sources and the animal sources end up, providing about the same results. Now, obviously, we touched on soy a fair bit there, so I would be remiss if I didn't spend at least a couple slides, um, debunking some of the concerns around soy. And the biggest concern by far is that soy is estrogenic, that it's going to lead to um, breast growth in men, or tanking your testosterone, or whatever other concerns you've heard out there. But and while soy does contain what are called isoflavones, which are a type of phytoestrogen, they are not estrogen. They're different. They are called phytoestrogens because some structural characteristics of the phytoestrogens are similar to estrogen. So they can interact with estrogen receptors. However, they bind to those receptors with about 1/1000th the affinity of our own endogenous estrogens, the estrogens that we produce, so not as strongly. And they preferentially bind to certain types of receptors called estrogen receptor beta, which are concentrated in bone tissue, and that's a really good thing. We want more estrogen, uh, estrogenic kind of interactions with the bone tissue, as that helps to maintain bone mineral density. But those receptors may actually have anti-estrogenic effects in breast tissue, and that's also good. Too much estrogen in breast tissue can promote breast cancer, whereas anti-estrogenic effects would presumably do the opposite. And we actually see that soy consumption consistently decreases breast cancer risk in populations who are consuming soy regularly. So, if anything, we're seeing results in sort of opposite direction of what's typically claimed. And even women who are predisposed to breast cancer due to genetic variants, or who have survived breast cancer, appear to benefit from consumption. And this is actually recognized by the American Cancer Society and the Canadian Cancer Societies. And I'm sure others across the globe, but I haven't necessarily looked at every country's, being a Canadian myself. Um, but it is recognized by those bodies, and they do discuss the potential benefits there. And we have dozens of randomized controlled trials now consistently showing that soy does not alter estrogen or testosterone levels, or cause breast growth in men. Now, where the controversy typically stems from are rodent studies where rodents will be fed or injected with very high doses of these phytoestrogens and might run into problems. But for one, we're not consuming them in isolation like that, and we aren't rodents, and the doses we consume are typically much, much less. And then there are a couple extreme case studies where people were consuming in the ballpark of, 14, 15, up to, 20 servings of soy a day, and potentially running into some issues. And even then, it's not clear if soy was the problem, or the fact that they had a diet that only consisted of basically one food and wasn't very well rounded, or perhaps other variables. But even if we say it was the soy, which isn't confirmed, it's obviously a very extreme case. Whereas, like in clinical trials, we have data, at least in men, of going up to 4 or 5 servings a day easily. In women, if we look at phytoestrogen studies or like the supplement studies, it goes even much higher than that. So I don't see any reason to be concerned at those levels of intake. Now, we also have an umbrella review of 114 meta-analyses and systematic reviews, so a massive, massive review of the literature, as well as a scoping review that came a little bit later. Um, and they found that higher soy intake was associated with a lower risk of developing ovarian cancer, gastric cancer, prostate cancer, colorectal cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer, dying of cardiovascular disease, at least for fermented soy in particular, um, cardiovascular disease, stroke, coronary heart disease, and type 2 diabetes. So we're seeing numerous benefits across the board with pretty large reductions in risk in some cases, with no clear sign of harm, really. We'll touch on one potential harm on the next slide, but not even related to soy per se. Then we also have, from randomized controlled trials, data suggesting that there are improvements in a number of cardiovascular markers like artery function, blood pressure, cholesterol, triglycerides, a little bit of weight loss, potentially improved cognitive function, and isoflavone or phytoestrogen supplements decreasing hot flash severity and frequency, and reducing vaginal dryness in menopause. So, plenty of potential benefits. One thing I do want to caution against, though, is that these numbers for the various outcomes are based on varying levels of evidence. So, for some of these things like breast cancer, the evidence is pretty strong. For some of the other outcomes, the evidence is so-so at this point. It's suggestive of a benefit. We're not seeing harm, which is fantastic, but I wouldn't, write home necessarily that every single one of these is spot on as far as results because the data for some of the outcomes is a bit limited. But again, the take home is we are not seeing harm here. And if anything, we're seeing plenty of benefits. Now, that same umbrella review found one potential harm, and that was miso soup increased risk of gastric cancer, stomach cancer by 17%. However, if we go back here, we see that stomach cancer risk was reduced by 22%. So it's weird that soy appears to reduce stomach cancer risk, but miso soup may increase risk. And actually, what it likely is that miso soup is very high in sodium. Or salt, and salt can increase stomach cancer risk. So it's not even the soy necessarily, it's more likely the fact that there's just a lot of salt in there that's doing it. And then finally, soy safety has also been investigated in children, and soy milk is currently the only plant milk recommended for children after age 1 by the American Academy of Pediatrics and after age 2 by the Canadian Pediatric Society. The main reason for the CPS suggesting after 2 is that breastfeeding is recommended to continue for 2 years. So after that, once the milks are consumed. And soy formula is considered an acceptable alternative for full-term infants as well. And I believe this is my last slide on soy. Soy is also very nutritious. We see that an extra firm block of tofu, or rather half a block of tofu, provides quite a bit of protein, decent amount of calcium, uh, decent dose of iron as well, a bit of the omega-3s, a non-negligible amount, and some choline. It's one of the few plant foods that are relatively rich in choline. Soy milk also can be a good source of protein, calcium, especially if it's fortified, very good source of calcium, a little bit of iron, and then typically because of the fortification, B12 as well. And I just used a very common brand for these numbers. I believe it was a Silk brand I looked at, but they're all very similar as long as they're fortified. And then edamame as a whole soy food, also a very good option. A lot of protein there when it comes to beans and legumes, decent amount of iron, zinc, again, omega-3s, vitamin K, folate, and choline. And then tempeh is the final one here. Also a great source of protein and other micronutrients. So all around, soy seems to be quite a good option. I'm just going to take a quick sip before I move on. Okay, so now we're back to the plant-based meats and heart health topic. And I'm not going to go over every trial. At the time that we published our review, there were 6 that we thought were relevant. Now there's been a few more, so not going to spend a ton of time going through every one, but there are a couple that I'm going to highlight that I think have some sort of unique aspects that can help shed light on this topic. So this is arguably the most famous of the topics or of these studies on this topic. And this was called the swap meat trial done by researchers at Stanford, including Chris Gardner. Um, and they had they had 36 participants, and the trial was 16 weeks long. Now it was a crossover trial, meaning that for 8 weeks, the participants consumed one food, and then for the other 8 weeks, they were given the opposite food. So in the plant-based phase, they were given Beyond Meat products, and these were the older, less healthy versions as well. But things like the Beyond Burgers, sausages, I think they had like vegan chicken nuggets or something. There's a list of them. And then in the animal phase, they were given organic and grass-fed meat products. So not even just your regular conventional meats, they were given the ones that some people view as healthier. I wouldn't say there's a big difference, but at least from the optics viewpoint, some people believe they are. And then participants were instructed to consume at least 2 servings of either or per day. So if they're in the Beyond Meat phase, at least 2 servings of the Beyond Meat products per day. If they're in the meat phase, at least 2 servings of the meats per day. And they found that in the plant-based group, there was a reduction in TMAO. This is a marker that has been associated with cardiovascular disease. I'd say there's some debate around whether it's causally associated. I tend to view that it's probably not based on the available data, but it is associated with risk anyway. There was a little bit of a reduction in weight, about 1 kilogram, but keep in mind that this was a very small change in diet. All they were doing was changing out meat for Beyond Meat, and they still lost a bit of weight, which is, if anything, impressive. Um, for LDL cholesterol levels, went down by about 11 points, 10.8 points. That is absolutely meaningful. That is clinically relevant. That could lower your risk of cardiovascular disease by simply swapping out meat for Beyond Meat products. Again, would it be great if people would switch meat for lentils or something? Sure, but a lot of people won't do that. If, from a public health perspective, if people swapped out just the meat for the plant-based meats, at least these ones, we could likely see some significant improvements in risk. And then there were no significant differences in blood pressure, which I wanted to highlight because plant-based meats are typically quite high in sodium. Now we see that actually at the end of the day, there weren't significant differences in sodium intake, potentially because of salt that is added to meat products, whether for preservation or for flavoring. Um, Fiber intake was not significantly different between the plant phase and animal phase, although it tended to be a bit higher in the plant phase, but not statistically significant. Daily protein intake, almost identical, but the saturated fat intake went down. So those in the plant-based phase consumed on average 26 grams of saturated fat per day, whereas those in the animal phase consumed an average of 33 grams. So 6 gram difference, which is absolutely meaningful. And that probably explains why there was a lower LDL cholesterol in those on the in the plant phase. Now, the second trial that I want to touch on here was looking at red meat, textured soy protein. So these are like, I don't know if you've seen those soy chunks that you can get in some shops, or sometimes you can buy it as a powder. But basically, it acts as a meat substitute, but it's basically just uh, soy with a lot of the fat removed and the proteins been concentrated. And I think it works really well as like an addition to stir fries and things like that if you're looking for little like chunky kind of meaty foods. And this would be a bit less processed than things like a Beyond Meat, just to give a little bit of a different perspective here as well. And then we have soy nuts, which are whole soy. And this was also a randomized crossover trial like the last trial, and they had 42 postmenopausal women with metabolic syndrome. And there were 3 phases to this. So each participant went through all 3 phases, and they were 8 weeks each. So the first one was a DASH diet, which is a very healthy, like Mediterranean style diet with 1 serving of red meat per day. The second phase was a DASH diet with 30 grams of the textured soy protein products. And then the third was a DASH diet with the soy nuts. And I made this table to hopefully illustrate these results a bit. If you compare red meat to soy protein, the soy protein led to reductions in total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, ApoB, which is an even more accurate marker of cardiovascular risk than LDL cholesterol or total cholesterol. There was no significant difference in fasting glucose, but there was a reduction in fasting insulin and HOMA-IR, which is a measure of insulin resistance. So we're seeing plenty of benefits here just from swapping the red meat for the kind of, again, the soy chunks or the textured soy protein. When you swap out red meat for soy nuts, so the whole soy, again, benefits for all of those, including a reduction in fasting glucose. And then when you look at the swap of soy protein for soy nuts, actually the soy nuts did come out on top with lower total and LDL cholesterol, though the difference in ApoB was not statistically significant. But then again, reductions in glucose, insulin, and HOMA-IR. So of these three, the soy nuts, the whole soy with all the fats in there, with all the fiber and everything, did appear to come out a bit further on top than the textured soy protein, but the textured soy protein did well compared to the meat, especially. And just earlier this year, this was, I believe it was in February that it was published. There was a meta-analysis on plant-based meats and heart health, and they looked at 7 randomized controlled trials at the time. Again, like I said, I think there's been even a couple others since they wrote up this meta-analysis. And they found that the plant-based meats reduced total cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and body weight, and there were no significant differences in glucose, triglycerides, or blood pressure. And again, that blood pressure finding is interesting given the sodium content. Now, they did an additional analysis where they looked specifically at those mycoprotein-based products because there were a few trials that looked at those products specifically, and they were effective for lowering total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol. And this is very much in line with the review that we published. If you look over on the right side, we saw that most studies reported reductions in total and LDL cholesterol, relatively equivalent blood pressure between the meats and plant-based meats. And then some studies reported reductions in ApoB, body weight, and waist circumference. So the conclusions on heart health would be that plant-based meat alternatives may improve cardiovascular risk factors compared to meat without any clear harms. However, there is potential for different effects from different plant-based meats due to the nutritional variability, which I highlighted. And further research is warranted in some areas. I would love to see some longer term research looking at actual like heart attacks and strokes versus just the markers like LDL cholesterol. I would love to see some research on seitan or bio-wheat gluten, as that's pretty limited at this point as well. I'd like to see some further studies on products that are low in saturated fats, because most of what's been done so far use products that were higher in saturated fats. And then what I think a lot of people here may be interested in is I'd like to see more comparisons between plant-based meats and other plant foods. So yeah, we're seeing compared to meat, plant-based meats, come out on top. But how would that look if you were to compare, say, a Beyond or Impossible Burger or something to a black bean burger, or how about to tofu? I think that could, provide a little bit more context, and again, help us find out where on that spectrum the plant-based meats are. Oh yeah, now we're going to come back to these headlines. So as I touched on earlier, there were a lot of headlines going around last summer, and I would say every now and then we see more and more. And these were spawned from this study, the implications of food ultra-processing on cardiovascular risk, considering plant origin foods and analysis of the UK Biobank cohort. So they included 126, almost 127,000 participants in the UK Biobank, with a median of a 9-year follow-up. And they found that every 10% increase in ultra-processed plant food intake was associated with a 5% higher risk of cardiovascular disease and a 12% higher risk of dying due to cardiovascular disease. However, every 10% increase of non-ultra processed plant intake, so this would exclude, a lot of things like the pastries and the plant-based meats and all that. For every 10% increase, there was a 7% lower risk of cardiovascular disease and a 13% lower risk of dying due to cardiovascular disease. So we're seeing that the ultra-processed plants, not so good. The non-ultra-processed plants, quite good. So what ultra-processed foods were they consuming, though? Well, they broke it down here. And we see that most of their ultra-processed plants were things like breads, pastries, biscuits, etc. And meat alternatives only made up 0.5% of their ultra-processed plants, or 0.2% of their whole diet. So based on this, we can't conclude that plant-based meats were good or bad or anything. Yet, if we go back to the headlines, they're all talking about plant-based meat alternatives. Vegan fake meats are associated, what does it say down here? The risks of common meat alternatives, such as vegan burgers and sausages. That is not what we conclude from this data, because almost nobody was consuming them, and those who were consuming very little. And so they just it seems like plant-based meats are a very easy target, especially for the media that is much more pro meat. They want to bash these plant-based meat alternatives, and I think let's be very honest about the research and what we know and what we don't know. But I'd say this is pretty dishonest reporting, because this study tells us absolutely nothing about meat alternatives specifically. And what none of the headlines will mention, that even non-ultra processed animal foods were worse than the plant foods, than the non-ultra processed plant foods. So higher risks of cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease, yet none of them reported that. So super, super dishonest stuff. 2 weeks later, though, our review came out and took over headlines, and it was awesome to see. All over global, U.S. News, World Report, Men's Health, NBC News, and then obviously the like Veg News and other plant-based networks. So it was great. It was a great turnaround, and I kind of think that the kind of media spin of that earlier study just a couple weeks prior really helped push ours out there once it came out, suggesting, if anything, the opposite. So I was very happy to see that. Now, if we move on to cancer, and there's very limited research here, so this will be quick. There is some research on breast cancer from the Adventist Health Study too, and there were 52,795 women in North America with about an 8-year follow-up. They found no clear association between soy-based meat alternatives and breast cancer risk, but the data was very limited as far as how many people were consuming them regularly and how much was being consumed. So I would say we can't draw strong conclusions one way or another, but again, we're not seeing any clear harm at least, which is good. Um, Now, for pancreatic cancer, there was an earlier study called the Advanced Health Study 1, the original. This had 34,000 participants with up to 8 years of follow-up. And those with the highest plant-based meat intake had an 85% lower risk of dying due to pancreatic cancer. And that was comparable to the results for whole legumes. However, we need to be cautious when we cite this study. They adjusted for age, sex, smoking, meat, poultry, fish intake, legumes, and fruits. So they accounted for some of these other variables, but they did not account for alcohol, socioeconomic status, and uh, exercise habits. And there are a lot of variables that weren't taken into account. So I wouldn't go around suggesting that plant-based meat's lower risk of pancreatic cancer mortality by 85% quite yet. But again, it's promising to see, if anything, an association with lower risk versus higher risk. If we were seeing a higher risk there, obviously that would be a little more concerning. Again, keeping in mind that they didn't adjust for a lot of variables. And then finally, we have a little bit of research on plant-based meats and bone health. Again, if we look at the Adventist Health Study 2, and in this particular analysis, they had just over 33,000 participants with about a 5-year follow-up. And daily plant-based meat intake was associated with a 49% lower risk of hip fracture, similar to the results for both legumes and meat. It's a very positive result, and that may in part be due to the protein content. Plant-based meats are generally rich in protein, and higher protein consumption is associated with better bone health outcomes. So that could be why the things like the meats, legumes, and even, the plant-based meats, legumes, and even the animal-based meats are associated with lower risk. And then finally, for fracture, this was a combined analysis between the Adventist Health Study and Adventist Health Study 2 with 1,865 peri and postmenopausal women, but a very lengthy follow-up, so up to 25 years. And they found that daily vegetable protein intake, so this is protein from things like beans, nuts, soy milk, and plant-based meats, was associated with a 68% lower risk of wrist fracture. But plant-based meats alone, if consumed 4 times a week, were not significantly associated with lower risk. The results suggested a potential lower risk of about 46%, but because it was not statistically significant, we can't rule out a chance finding here. But it's possible. And then consuming beans more than even just twice a week was associated with a 65% lower risk of wrist fracture in that analysis. So beans were looking real good. Now moving on to some of the a couple slides on the environmental impact. When it comes to the carbon footprint, if we look at beef, here on the left side of this line would be like the best case scenario for beef as far as carbon emissions per kilogram of product. And then on the right side, we see worst case scenario. Even the best case scenario of beef, or even beef from dairy, is worse than the worst case scenario for plant-based meats. On average, the plant-based meats are better than either chicken, pork, or beef, um, maybe a little worse than tofu as far as the carbon emissions. But you have to really cherry pick like best case chicken or best case pork and worst case plant-based meats to make a case that the animal products are better off. So we're seeing, across the board here, the plant-based meats are pretty climate friendly. And if we look at land use per 100 grams of protein, plant-based meats use 41% less land than farmed fish, 77% less than poultry, 82% less than pig meat, 89% less than beef from dairy, and 98% less than beef from a beef herd. As far as water use per 100 grams of protein, plant-based meats use 76% less than poultry, 77% less than beef, 89% less than pig meat, and orders of magnitude, it was off the charts for compared to farm fish. So I couldn't even extract the number from the figure. It was so high. So we're seeing a pretty nice picture here from an environmental standpoint as well. So if I were to give some tips on choosing healthier plant-based meat products, if you are opting to consume some, I would first look for products that are low in saturated fat. I would make that the top priority for most people, unless cholesterol levels are in an excellent range, and maybe you're more concerned about sodium or something. I generally would suggest 3 grams of saturated fat or less per serving if consuming them regularly. If it's a once in a while thing, it's probably not going to matter too much. For sodium, I generally look at about 300 milligrams or less. This will limit you a lot in which products you choose because a lot of the products are 4, 5, 6 700 milligrams or even higher in some cases. So sodium can be one that does go quite high, and there aren't a lot of products with lower amounts of sodium. I would then look for products that are higher in protein, so about 20 grams or more is a pretty good mark to try to hit. And then I would look for products that are higher in fiber. Fiber sort of last on the list because even the highest fiber products aren't going to be that high, but you might see a difference of like 1 or 2 grams versus, 5 or 6 grams, and maybe that's meaningful depending on the individual. So just to summarize, compared to meat, plant-based meat alternatives generally have a more heart-healthy nutrition profile and improved cardiovascular risk factors. The available studies have not identified risks of plant-based meats. There is significant variability in plant-based meats, though, so I wouldn't be surprised if certain ones are potentially a bit more risky than others. So something to keep in mind. And I kind of just pointed out some tips with choosing products. The negative headlines that we typically see are around misrepresenting study findings or other, sort of false concerns. Plant-based meats may lower fracture and pancreatic cancer mortality risk, but we definitely need more data there. And then plant-based meats are a more climate-friendly choice than meat, which I know for a lot of people is very, very important. And that's really it for the presentation portion. And happy to move on to Q&A around a lot of this stuff. If you aren't already, you can follow me on basically all the social medias. Just type my name in and it should pop right up. And then I also have a guide to optimal cholesterol levels, just kind of going over which foods raise cholesterol levels, which ones lower them, what are the ideal levels, and all of that. And you can download it at drmatthewnagra.com/resources for free, or you can scan the QR code there. But yeah, otherwise, I'm happy to hop on to questions.
Great. Great. Thank you for the presentation. Really appreciate it. So, all right. So you gave everybody your information. So that's great. So, what inspired you to get into talking about plant-based meats?
Yeah, so there's a couple things actually. For one, it wasn't even something that I consumed super often. It was just that when I realized that a lot of people who, let's say, aren't plant-based or vegan or in this, especially the health space, a lot of them aren't going to swap out their beef burger for a bowl of lentils or, for baked beans or swap out their bacon for baked beans for breakfast or something. And so, understanding that this is a much easier swap for people to make and it could potentially be very meaningful on a population level, I was interested in, well, what does the research actually say about it thus far? And I was very aware of that swap meat trial that I went over because that one did, get a lot of media attention, but I was not aware of a lot of the other ones out there. And I actually had one of my colleagues here at UBC was interested in conducting a clinical trial, which we're still working on getting going. And before we got into, designing that and then eventually, trying to seek funding and all of that, he thought it would be a good idea to write up a literature review first. And so I actually drafted up a review of kind of what was out there and I did my searches and everything. And I handed over. I was like, hey, this is what we know so far, and this is stuff that we could research a little further. And he's like, you know what? This is really good. We should just we could tweak a few things and help kind of formalize it, and we can maybe try to publish it. And that's really how it came together. And then having published that paper, having gotten the media attention that it did, people started asking me to talk about it more and more. And so I sort of designed this presentation around that, and I tweak it a little bit here and there depending on the audience. But that's really what drove me to being more interested in the topic.
So did you find that people who were meat eaters were staying away from the plant-based meats because of what they were hearing? Was actually effective at keeping people away?
Absolutely, 100%. And I like being on social media, especially, I see it all the time. I see so many people, fear mongering over the number of ingredients, the chemical names, the fact that they're processed, and especially when those headlines came out of the UK Biobank study, they were all over the place. I was seeing it nonstop, and it was such a misrepresentation of I wouldn't be upset if it was the truth of what they found. If they did find that plant-based meats were causing these issues, absolutely people need to know that. But the fact that it was such a misrepresentation of the study findings is what was sort of upsetting about that. And once it's out there, and I can't remember who's promoting it, but people like Joe Rogan and whoever, once a platform like that puts it out, it's very hard to kind of bring everybody back to reality and kind of showcase, no, this isn't actually what it showed. So yeah, it's out there all the time.
do you find that people who are meat eaters who try a Beyond Burger without, or the plant-based meats without that preconceived notion, do they respond to it positively or negatively?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of like you'll see a lot of videos of blind taste tests, but there are actually a couple published studies on this where they did blind taste tests and actually recorded the responses. And what's really funny about that is in the couple that I've seen, the plant-based meats actually do better than the animal-based meats. Now that is it's in a sense an unfair comparison because the Beyond Meats or the plant-based meats are already seasoned, right? So when they're in the package, they already have some of those like well, I don't know what like garlic powder or whatever they're putting in there for the flavoring but and a little bit of the salt. Whereas if they're comparing it to a plain Beyond Burger versus a plain beef burger, well, the beef burger doesn't have any seasoning yet, so it doesn't taste as good. But in those taste tests, anyway, people favor the plant-based meats. But even in the blind taste tests we've seen in other forms, people tend to like the plant-based meats if they don't really know what they're getting. And there was a really funny viral moment on one of the UK talk shows, I believe it was, where this self-proclaimed sausage expert. I don't know how he got that title, but self-proclaimed was given two like sausages to try or something like that, and he's like, oh, this one's the plant-based or this one's the animal-based one. It's excellent, it's juicy, it's whatever. This one's the plant-based one. It tastes like crap. It's garbage. And it turns out they both were plant-based, and they tricked him. And it was just like such a funny. And then he tried to walk it back after the fact. So there is a bias there for sure.
So would you, if someone is eating a whole food plant-based diet
Mhm.
and they're successfully doing it, so they're already past that transition phase, do you recommend the plant-based meats as a healthy part of that diet, or is that more of a transition type of food?
I wouldn't recommend it necessarily to anybody. Like, I don't think anybody needs to. I don't think it's, if someone's eating whole foods plant-based that they're going to improve their health by incorporating them. My stance is more so for one, if you're swapping out meat for plant-based meats, it's a win, in based on the research that we've seen, it's pretty consistently a win. But if you're somebody who's eating a whole foods diet and like, occasionally you want to indulge in a plant-based meat or something, I don't see an issue with that. I think that's fine. It can factor in, but I'm not going to go being like, hey, you should be eating these things. Like it's going to improve your health necessarily. That's not really my position on it.
So if somebody had a decent percentage of their diet coming from this kind of these types of products, what would you expect the health outcome to be?
Let's say if it was a majority, I would be concerned about the sodium content at that point if they were having like several servings a day, just because even the lower sodium options are not necessarily super low. So that's potentially a concern. But even so, like it depends on what they're eating instead. If they were eating a diet where they're having bacon and sausages for breakfast, they're having, a meat sandwich for lunch, and then they're having a burger for dinner, and they replaced all of those with the plant-based products, I would actually expect the plant-based products to improve their health. Right. So it really comes down to what you're comparing it to. But
Mhm.
generally speaking, would I say it's ideal to be having them, 3, 4 times a day every day? Probably not, if for nothing else, just the sodium content.
So what do you consider in the standard diet to be the most critical dietary factors that contribute to heart disease?
Um, so do you want like food or actually, I'll give the nutrients and I'll talk about which
I,
foods. Yeah.
I'll take anything.
Okay.
Go
Okay.
for it. Go for it. You
Okay.
have to say on it.
Yeah, yeah. So I would say one of the biggest factors, bar none, is the saturated fat content. So, saturated fats primarily found in high-fat dairy products like butters and cream, in a lot of meats, especially the fattier cuts of meats. It can be in things like coconut oil, but that's not like super commonly consumed in the population, even though it's a bit more so maybe in the plant-based community. But the saturated fat content is one that is critical to help lower our LDL cholesterol levels and ultimately our cardiovascular risk. But what you replace the saturated fat with is also important. So if you're replacing it with just a bunch of refined grains and added sugars, you're probably not doing yourself a lot of favors. But if you're replacing it with higher fiber foods or polyunsaturated fats from things like, nuts and seeds, for example, that could be quite beneficial and make a significant difference. So, yeah, the saturated fat is one. And then second, it's not so much something that's in the standard diet, but something that is lacking in the standard diet is fiber. So now that's a bit of a cop-out answer here because fiber is just prevalent in whole plant foods. So it's basically me telling people, hey, eat more whole plant foods in general. But the fiber is probably the other big piece. I'd say those are two of the biggest.
Okay. And I'm sorry, you were going to say, I think you were going to say some other things outside of food as well.
Oh, no, no. So the nutrients were saturated fat and fiber, and then I listed the foods that they
Oh,
apply to.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And is the so the plant-based meats became, popular for a while. What's the
Mhm.
trend line look like now for these products?
Yeah, so I mean, they've come and gone in sort of waves. There was actually, there's a really good article. I'm trying to remember if somebody knows where it was published, please drop it in the chat. But it was an interview with the CEO of Beyond Meat, Ethan Brown, and they discussed sort of the very intentional pushback and messaging from the meat industry around the processing of plant-based meats and the chemical components and all of that, and it worked. Like that's the thing that Ethan actually discusses in the article, is that he knew that this pushback was coming, but what was sort of shocking about it is that it actually was very effective and it really worked, and it created this sort of fear around plant-based meats, much of which was unwarranted, and led to a bit of a downfall in the at least certain plant-based meat products. Now, I think there's a bit of a comeback happening. I think that's a part of why Beyond Meat did reformulate their products to really focus on the health aspects. So hopefully we see a bit of a turnaround here. I know they're coming out with a documentary actually on plant-based meats, which I was fortunate enough to partake in, at least a small part. And I know that's coming soon. I don't think I can give the release date yet, but there's a couple little trailers on their socials. But yeah, like I'm hoping that we see a bit of a turnaround, because again, I don't think anybody needs to consume these products, but especially when we're talking about the debate between plant-based meats and meats, I mean, it's no contest. And I think they've really done a good job messaging and creating fear around it.
And if I remember correctly, the change they made with the oil was canola to avocado. Is that, do you know why that was done? Was that because of like the how like the kind of, I hate the word conspiracy, but the idea that seed oils
Yeah.
are really bad for you, which I believe canola oil is a seed oil. So avocado oil would seem better just regardless of the nutritional, values.
So it was a combination of canola and coconut that they swapped out.
Okay.
So the
Okay.
coconut is where the saturated fat came from. And so yeah, they swapped those out for the avocado oil. And it was funny because I did chat with Ethan about this, when they were interviewing me for that documentary. And and I asked, I said, just curious, did you swap out, instead of just going to straight canola oil or something, did you swap it out for avocado because of the concerns? And he said, yeah, there was like pushback. I don't know if that's the whole reason why. Maybe there might have been something to do with textures and flavors and whatnot. I'm sure that plays a role. But a part of it was sort of the concerns over canola oil, even though I'm very much in the camp that no, I think they're absolutely fine to consume. But you have to, when you're working on selling products to the masses, you kind of have to factor in the public perception, whether right or wrong.
So well, let's discuss that for a moment. So seed
Yeah.
oils have a reputation, and what warranted or not. What is the reputation that people are saying about seed oils, and what is the literature show about their health value?
Yeah, so there are, I mean, it's sort of the one thing that every diet camp seems to agree on, is that seed oils are toxic, and I always argue that they're all wrong. So, um, so and I, just to be clear, I want to be very clear here. I used to be in that camp. Okay, this isn't something like I came to and I'm, fighting the good fight or anything. I really staunchly believed that they were not healthy for us, and then I was convinced with the evidence. And so the common claims that are made are that one, they're inflammatory. And this is very speculative. This is because these seed oils typically are rich in linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fat. And theoretically, that omega-6 fat could be converted into another one that called arachidonic acid, which could be inflammatory. And in theory, that's fine. But in practice, we actually have randomized controlled trials where they'll feed these oils to people, and they've never shown, at least with normal types of consumption, increases in inflammatory markers ever. There's not one trial. And so that doesn't pan out. And in fact, we don't even see an increase in that arachidonic acid, omega-6 fat in the body after consumption. So that doesn't pan out. Now, the second thing that gets brought up is that they're um, they're heavily processed, or they use hexane sometimes, which is a chemical that can be toxic to extract the oils from say the rapeseed plant. Well, the thing is, the reason they use hexane is that it boils at a lower temperature. So all they have to do is heat the oil, like once they've extracted it, because it dissolves into hexane. Oils dissolve into hexane, whereas oils don't dissolve into water. If you pour oil in a cup of water, it separates. So they'll pass the hexane through, it'll kind of pull out all the oil, and then you heat the oil, and the hexane just evaporates away because it evaporates at a very low temperature. So you're left with basically zero. If anything, there might be very, very trace amounts left, but it's not harmful. And just to illustrate that, if you were to step out of your car at a gas station for a number of seconds, you would ingest much more hexane than you're ever getting from these oils, just in the air. So it's a very, very low exposure. And then at the end of the day, what matters most are the health outcomes. So when we look at long-term randomized controlled trials like the LA Veterans Administration Hospital study, where they actually had people living in an institution, modifying the foods that they're eating to remove saturated fat and add a bunch of these vegetable oils, we see that it lowers cardiovascular risk, improves mortality outcomes. And long-term prospective cohort studies like the recent Nurses Health and Health Professionals follow-up study with over 200,000 people found that these plant oils, even excluding olive oil, so specifically the seed oils, lower risk of mortality. Those who consume more have a lower risk of total mortality and certain types of mortality. So if there were concerns around these products, they're doing a really bad job of harming us because the data is
Wait,
very
wait, can you repeat that? You said that the oils were actually reducing risks, like all the
yes.
oils, including
Yeah.
olive oil, were reducing
Yeah,
risks?
yeah. So when you lump the plant oils with olive oil, they lower risk of mortality. So that's death during this 33-year period. But then they also did an analysis where they removed olive oil from that because olive oil is viewed differently often, like a lot of more health conscious people would choose olive oil. So to help prevent that from biasing the results, they did another analysis with just the seed oils, and they still lowered risk of mortality. So those who consume more versus those who consume less. And that's after adjusting for like diet quality and stuff. So you're looking at people eating a pretty similar overall diet quality, and the oils still end up being beneficial.
Okay, so yeah, I'm a little confused because that kind of is contrary to pretty much every doctor with regard to oil. I mean, very few people that we've heard over the conference have said that adding this oil in actually conferred health benefits in general, which is, am I correct that that's what you're saying, that adding in,
Yep.
regardless of whether it's olive oil or these seed oils, it actually was a healthy result?
Yeah, but that's consistent. And we have further data on like for example, blood biomarkers. So one thing that's interesting about these oils, because they are so rich in linoleic acid, that omega-6, we can actually measure the levels in your body, and we don't make it. So the only reason it's there is because you consumed it, and the main source are vegetable oils. And so those with higher levels in their tissues also have lower risks of mortality. And that's not based on self-report. That's not based on, questionnaires or anything. That's literally based on measuring, hey, have you been consuming a lot of these through their blood biomarkers? And yeah, it's very consistent. And I know there's a narrative in the plant-based space, especially kind of going the other direction. But my question would be based on what evidence, like what health outcome data can someone share to suggest that they're harmful? And I have not seen anything compelling, which is why I said I used to be on that other side. But when you look at the outcomes, the actual risks of cardiovascular disease, of total mortality, of cancer mortality, it's beneficial or neutral depending on what you're comparing it to. We even have studies comparing these oils to avocados. We have studies comparing them to nuts, and the results are about the same. And so a lot of where the confusion comes from are speculations around the types of fats, or like mechanistic studies where, for example, they'll look at how well the arteries dilate after consuming large amounts of oil. That's something that gets put out there a lot. But the thing is, these temporary fluctuations in arterial function don't necessarily translate to worse outcomes. For example, exercise does that. If you exercise, you can, cripple your arteries, so to speak, for a bit. But exercise is good for you. So why would we focus on this intermediate marker when we can look at the end result and see that exercise is very beneficial for you, just like we see with these oils? Nobody has to consume them. There are nuts and seeds and other sources for sure, but I don't think they should be, feared necessarily.
Can you name some of those studies? Because I'd like to
Yep.
present them to other
Yep.
doctors.
Yeah, so the Nurses Health Study and Health Professionals Follow-Up Study was the latest one. So it was a combined cohort, or they combined the two Nurses Health Studies and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study in one publication, came out on March 4th, I believe. There is the NIH AARP study, which looked at olive oil, canola oil, and corn oil, and then butter and margarine as well. There's the PREDIMED study, which looked at the Mediterranean diet plus olive oil versus the Mediterranean diet plus nuts, and you got pretty similar results regardless. There was also another publication from the Nurses Health Study and Health Professionals Follow-Up Study looking at avocados and the substitution with either olive oil or vegetable oils. There was the LA Veterans Administration Hospital Study, which was a long-term randomized controlled trial looking at seed oils. And then there was a meta-analysis by Lee et al., Li et al., looking at the blood biomarkers or tissue biomarkers, sorry, as I mentioned. And then finally, there's a meta-analysis by Hooper et al. In the Cochrane collaboration, looking at the randomized controlled trials on the topic. So the LA veterans plus other randomized controlled trials, putting them together, and it's consistent across the board. There's really only two trials that suggest harm, and they were using margarines that were very rich in trans fats. And so it was the trans fats that were bad, not the vegetable oils necessarily.
Okay. Yeah, I would love to get you on a panel with some of these other doctors
I would
talking.
love to. Sorry, I'm just closing my door because there's a
Yeah, no,
vacuum going off.
go for it. Go for it.
We'll make sure you don't get much background noise there.
So how were people getting the oil into their diet?
Yeah, so that's actually really cool. They looked at different methods in some of these studies, but so they could be for things like stir frying vegetables, they could be for baking purposes, they could be as spreadables. I, I mean, it doesn't really matter. The only time that I would be concerned, and it's not necessarily because of the oil per se, it's more so the package that it ends up being in, is around like deep frying, especially for very long periods of time, because you're just loading up the calorie density of that food. You're often adding, salts and things there. So I would say that those are um, some of the concerns I would have over deep frying. But otherwise, whether it's used for cooking some veggies or for putting on a salad or for using as a spreadable, I think is fine.
So other than deep frying, oil in whatever quantities, or was there like was there a point at which oil consumption became problematic? And I don't mean to belabor this point, it's just so
Yeah, no, no, no,
contrary
please
to
do.
everything
Yeah.
that we hear. So if somebody was consuming olive oil in ounces a day, um, would that is there an upper limit on this? Basically, is the question.
So if we look at typical consumption in these studies that I've cited, now some of them are higher, sure, but we typically see that on the high end, we're looking at maybe a couple tablespoons, like tops in the day. And that would be like if you use a tablespoon for cooking one meal, use a tablespoon at another meal or something. It's not like they're just taking the bottle and like dumping,
Yeah.
exuberant amounts on there. Yeah. So there is likely to be a point at which it's problematic simply because of the calorie density, if nothing else. And that goes for pretty much any food. But if we're looking at typical consumption, like coating a pan or drizzling on a salad or whatever it may be, that seems to be fine. We thus far, and this I think is super interesting. Thus far, I have not seen a single trial where oils led to weight gain. They might be neutral, in some studies, even a bit of weight loss. And that's probably due to the ways that they're used. So if you were talking about oils and you're using them to saute veggies or you're using them on a salad, for example, the calorie density of that meal is still very low, right? If you add, let's say you take a tablespoon, 100, 120 calories of oil and put it on a salad of primarily just veggies, the calories in that whole meal is gonna be like three, maybe 400 calories. It's not going to be very much. But if you're deep frying and you're literally soaking oil into this food, and you can turn something that's this small into 200 calories right there. And so that's why I don't think we see it translate necessarily to weight gain in these trials. But yes, there will be a point at which oil is too much, just like any other food.
And is this true for coconut oil, which has a high percentage of saturated fat?
So we don't have health outcome data on coconut oil. That's the thing. So coconut oil is Sorry, I think you froze there. Did anybody else see him or okay, no, sorry, you're back. You're back. You froze for a second. Um,
Yeah, okay.
yeah,
Sometimes I get
yeah. Yeah, I
real
just want to
stuff.
make sure you're still there. So coconut oil, because it's rich in saturated fat, and because we do have trials showing that it raises cholesterol relative to these other plant oils, it would be a concern of mine as far as the heart health aspect, just simply because of the saturated fat. However, we don't actually have long-term randomized controlled trials or even prospective cohorts looking at coconut oil. So we know that it increases as marker that probably leads to a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, but we just don't have that final result showing that it definitely does. It's kind of where we are with the plant-based meats. Like, hey, it looks really positive right now, but it would be nice to have that end result, that long-term prospective data to know for sure.
So are you comfortable recommending that people can have oil as part of their diet without worrying about it as long as it's not deep fried?
Yeah, absolutely. As long as they're liquid plant oils, the unsaturated fat-rich oils. So not the like coconut oils and things that are solid at room temperature. And again, use common sense. If you're literally taking shots of the stuff, I'd say you're probably taking too much. But if you're using them to cook foods or whatever, I see no issue.
Okay. So now, you were talking about soy and all the soy protein. So I want to ask you
Mhm.
a question about soy. Much has been made of organic versus non-organic or conventional soy. What are your thoughts on the health differences between the two?
So when we look at the data on soy consumption and health outcomes, we're looking at kind of average intake, and I would suspect that the majority is going to be non-organic. I think in the general population, that's just going to be the case. And so we're
Mhm.
seeing that it's quite beneficial. And if we look at data on organic versus non-organic in general, we don't see significant differences in health outcomes. So whether that's cancer outcomes or otherwise, it's pretty much a wash. It's pretty neutral. And that's because there are huge, huge safety nets built into like pesticide exposure. If you look at, say, uh, you look at occupational exposure. So you look at people working in fields where they're being sprayed with this stuff, inhaling this stuff, or even living next door. You can see sometimes increased risk in certain outcomes, certain types of cancers. But when it comes to like through food consumption, I don't see any reason to focus on organic over non-organic.
So you wouldn't recommend people spend the extra money for organic?
No, honestly, I think it's just it's marketing for a more expensive product. I don't think
Okay.
you
And
really need
so,
to.
so what are your thoughts on glyphosate? So that's not a concern at all?
In dietary exposure, I've never seen data suggesting worse outcomes, like long-term outcomes.
Okay.
There are massive safety nets built into to our exposure to these. Again, where there are potential concerns is if you're literally working and getting occupational exposure all day, every day, inhaling huge amounts, and so on.
And can you explain what you mean by the safety nets of pesticide
Yeah,
exposure?
so I'll make it super simple. These aren't the exact numbers just for reference, but just to illustrate the point. So let's say that we're testing a product for toxicity of some kind, or for harm. They will often do animal studies, typically using rodents, and they'll find like what is the lowest level of exposure that causes an issue. Let's say cancer development or whatever. And so they'll find, okay, what is that lowest level of exposure? It's this amount per, say, kilogram of their body weight. And then they extrapolate that to humans. Obviously, we're much bigger, so they would extrapolate that up to whatever that exposure would be for us. But then they will build in a massive safety net of like, again, I'm making this up just for sake of illustrating, but let's say 1/100th of that. And so our maximum exposure through a food will be like 1/100th of what could theoretically be the lowest possible exposure of harm. And so like you're just never going to consume anywhere near the amounts that are deemed problematic before you excrete it out and move on to your next day and kind of restart that. So there are big safety nets built in, and at this point, we again going back to what I said with the vegetable oils, we have to step back and look at what are the health outcomes, what actually happens to our like cancer risk, cardiovascular risk, diabetes risk, whatever, and we don't see significant differences uh, when we pool the results together. So we see pretty neutral effects on our health.
Okay. And during those tests, so if you talk to the glyphosate, the people who do the research on glyphosate and its
Mhm.
risks, one of the things they'll say is that the testing or the safety testing was done with the active ingredient. So it's just the glyphosate by itself. And when you and the when you add in all the inactive ingredients, it is so much more toxic. Do you know if these tests were conducted with the actual pesticide that gets sprayed, or if it was just the active ingredient itself?
I'd have to look at that to know for sure if they, I would assume that they would have to do the combination as well. But even if not, we have the human health outcome data on consumption of, say, organic versus non-organic. Like we have that data, so we can draw conclusions from that, suggesting that no, there isn't really a concern. So, the initial testing aside, I think we have better data at this point that is more pertinent to us.
And the reason I'm going to ask you for studies on that, just because I do want to, like, note these studies and talk to them with other people.
Mhm.
So do you
Mhm.
have studies that you're referring to?
Yeah, I don't have the titles or authors off the top of my head like I did with the oils, but I'm happy to send you after the fact.
Yeah, if you could,
Yeah.
that'd be greatly appreciated. And so there was a huge inflection point in the 1990s in the United States, and I'm sure either in the 90s or later in other countries, with obesity and various diseases that followed. What do you think the that might have been due to?
I think a big part of it is food environment. So, like, it's not like our genetics or anything changed. I think we've always been driven, or at least a large portion of us have always been driven to consume more, calorie dense, hyper palatable foods, but they weren't necessarily as available or as in our face as they later were. And I know you mentioned 1990s. I think it was even a little bit earlier, like 1980s. But when you look at like the explosion of fast food restaurants, the food advertising, what's available in the supermarkets, and how cheap some of these foods are. And food scientists in these industries have learned how to prey on our senses. So there's certain combinations of nutrients or ingredients that really drive us to overconsume. And these are the combinations of fat and sugar, sugar and salt, or salt and fat. So those combinations really drive us to overconsume. And when you think of a lot of what's available on, the confectionery, shelf or whatever, like those are the types of things that you're going to find there. And so I think that was a big part of it, is just the wide availability, and the how cheap a lot of these foods ended up becoming. Whereas to eat a healthy diet is more expensive. Unfortunately, it is to eat more like whole fruits and vegetables and whatnot in most cases.
Is it? I mean, like I when I transitioned, I my budget got cheaper, and when you talk to people who actually live whole food plant-based, like if you're eating the Beyond Burgers, it could be
Mhm.
expensive. If you're eating, processed foods that are plant-based, it could be expensive. But if you're eating actually just the vegetables, I mean, if you think about what's the most expensive thing, as a class is, you think the meat, you think the dairy, and you think eggs, right? As opposed to, produce. Is that not correct? Like what is expensive in the
Um,
plant-based diet?
Yeah, so if you look at some of the staples like rice and beans, yeah, they're generally quite cheap, especially if you're doing dry. I know canned is a little bit more. But if you look at like fruits and veggies, they can be rather pricey depending on like I know here at least some of the dark leafy greens and stuff are not cheap at all to even get kale and whatnot. But you also have to consider calorie density, right? So you're going to be eating a certain amount of calories minimum per day. And on a per calorie basis, certain types of meat and that can be quite cheap. Now, are we talking the extra lean, 97% lean beef or something? No, that's going to be more expensive. But the typical like 80/20 or 85/15 beef that you're going to pick up, that is a lot cheaper. Ground beef in particular, much, much cheaper on it, like for the amount of calories you're getting out of
On
that,
the
right?
calorie.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. So you always have to consider it. That's maybe not fair with fruits and veggies because you aren't consuming them as a main chunk of your caloric intake. But as far as like what is really making up a lot of those calories, yeah, they can be cheap if you're choosing certain types. And we know what types that like fast food restaurants will typically use. For example, like I don't, McDonald's has like that. Was it something a few dollar whatever menu? I can't remember. $5 menu.
The
The
dollar.
dollar is
See,
it?
you're obviously a Canadian because you're
Yeah.
American. You know about the McDonald's
I mean,
dollar menu.
okay. That's
Yes.
what it is. Yeah, like how can you beat that? You can't.
Well, I don't even think that I don't eat at McDonald's, so I don't know this, but
Yeah.
I don't even think they have their dollar menu anymore,
Oh,
or sort of
okay.
like $2. I think it's like I think they've changed some of that because everything's gotten more expensive. But to your point, I definitely this morning, and raspberries, strawberries, all that stuff is for something like this big. of,
Yeah.
in this shallow for raspberries can cost you $6. It is
Yeah.
somewhat obscene in regard to that. How do you recommend um, people transition from this highly addictive food? I mean, forget just even going plant-based, but you're talking about what you thought may contribute to the rise in obesity in this country, which is the fact that the food is so hyperpalatable and addictive. How do people get off of the addictive food onto less addictive food? And what does the less addictive food look like, whether it's plant-based or not plant-based?
So I think there's only so much on an individual level that you could do. I think really what we need is a more systemic change. But as far as on an individual level, when I'm working with individual patients, I will talk about I'll look at someone's diet and I'll look at what are some simple swaps that we could make. So, for example, if somebody's typically going out for a burger or a beef burrito or something from a fast food joint, I might suggest, well, here's a simple swap. Why not go to the Chipotle, like I don't know, I think you probably have them in the States too, like a burrito place. It's
Yes.
kind of like a Subway. Yeah, so how about go there? It's right next door, and you have like a bean burrito with a mix of veggies in there, and that might be something that's a bit more cost effective, very easy, and a good sort of stepping stone into some of those healthier options. And I look at what can we do to swap out individual foods, but without having to completely overhaul their diet overnight. Because I just don't think someone, if they are really stuck in that cycle, I don't think they're gonna go from fast food every meal to whole foods plant-based overnight. And so I like to take that approach. But on a systemic level, I think we need to have like I think we can reformulate foods to be healthier, just like Beyond did with their latest products. I think that is probably one of the bigger keys, lowering the sodium content, lowering the saturated fat content, adding some fiber if we can. There are other things that we can do there. And if we look at, say, in Finland, there was the North Karelia project. This was one of the most effective public health interventions I've ever seen. And what they did was they I want to say this was in the 80s. I can't remember the exact decade, but they had a lot of like public free education around smoking. They took out ads in TV around harms of smoking. They lowered the sodium content in the food supply. So they had people swapping out like sodium chloride for potassium-based salts, which taste similar but don't have the blood pressure effects. They started swapping out some of the saturated fat, things like butter and whatnot, for unsaturated fats. And over the course of, again, I can't recall how many years, we'll say maybe around a decade or so, they dropped the coronary heart disease rates in men by about 80%. It was unbelievable.
Wow.
And they had one of the highest rates in the world at the time. But this is very much a demonstration of like a concerted effort. They actually had government officials bring in like food scientists and nutrition experts to discuss like what are some of the important factors here? How can we make this, how can we bring this to the public and make it accessible and easy? That's the type of intervention that we need to see. I think smoking has been mostly taken care of as far as at least the education. If people still choose to, well, they know what they're doing. But with the food side of things, I think that we can have a huge impact if we had sort of government oversight like that. And it's not about necessarily telling people what to do or forcing anyone to do anything. It's just about, how do we make healthier options available, or how do we make the products that are already out there that people enjoy healthier, but without really compromising on the tastes. And if we can do that, we can have a huge, huge impact.
Do you see anybody that has any sort of public cachet, either in Canada or the United States, that gives you hope that they are championing this correctly?
I think now I haven't seen the final results yet, but I think the team behind the newest iteration of the U.S. dietary guidelines that's coming out end of the year, I think they're fantastic. I know a couple of them too. I think they're excellent scientists, and the report that came out where they're really emphasizing plant protein over animal protein as one of the big kind of shifts this time around was awesome to see. I have a lot of hope for where they're going with it, and but then the concern becomes, well, how is it implemented? You can put the report out there, you can put the guidelines out there, but how do you make that accessible to people? How do you encourage those choices? I think that's going to be the biggest challenge. But I'm very hopeful that at least the guidelines themselves will be really solid this time around.
Why do you think it's so early in in the conversation you were talking about how you thought a systemic approach would be more successful than an individual approach. You didn't really think that it was really possible that way. Why is it so hard on the individual level to make this shift, at least for yourself? And what are the common challenges that people face when trying to do so?
Yeah, so I mean, everyone's gonna have a different baseline just due to genetics more than anything. But if we look at let's say well, let's just look at obesity, for example. What really seems to drive that is not just the environment, it's not just genetics, it's the interaction between genetics and the environment. It's that some people have a stronger drive to consume more. And so they're either not satiated off of typical amounts of consumption or they're just constantly hungry. And I've worked with a lot of people on this where they talk about food noise. It's something that consumes them. They're always thinking about it. If they're walking down the street and they see, their one of their favorite restaurants or whatever, it's like it's always there in the back of their head and they can't shake it unless they go in and do something about it. Whereas I can walk by and just not care. It's just we're programmed differently that way. Now, in a world where that isn't right there and in your face all the time, obviously it's much easier. But as soon as it is, like you can't get rid of that sensation. And so, I mean, that's actually one of the reasons that these new medications, the GLP-1 agonists like Ozempic and whatnot, have been so successful is because they get rid of that. They level the playing field there so that somebody who is consumed by those thoughts and those urges is now on my playing field where I'm not consumed by those. And I can, just shake whatever it is that's in my face, or I can stop eating when I'm satisfied. And so that's what it is. It's just that some people are programmed by no fault of their own to really be consumed by those thoughts, and then you put them in today's environment, and it's a losing battle.
Now, and I agree with you that to no fault of their own, the food like system is really kind of against us. But when people are not eating the hyper addictive foods, does
Mhm.
that noise go away? So to some extent, the individual has to go through a struggle period, but could actually migrate out of it so that they could get to the state where you're at, where you can walk down the street, you can see all of the, the food around you and not be, consumed by it.
For some people, yes. For some people, it's more difficult, and so it's just there's different levels to this. So I don't know that there's a blanket answer for that. But yeah, everybody's going to be a little bit different in the way that they respond. For some people, if they start to make, that's another reason that I do like small steps. Some people start to make steps. They might start with lunch or dinner and be like, hey, it's actually pretty easy, and then they move on to the next meal a few weeks down the line, then on to the next meal, and they slowly kind of overhaul it. Whereas for somebody else, even that sort of a step could be really challenging, and there's just too much noise around them. So hard to give a just a single broad answer.
Sure. And you mentioned, reformulating food as part of a solution, like in the
Mhm.
European example that you gave. Um, should we really be in an ideal world? Should we be eating processed food at all?
I think we I
I'm
think
talking
there
about
are
the hyper
benefits.
processed.
Yeah,
Right?
so I think there are some potential upsides to certain types of ultra processed foods. So, for example, if we look at like even isolated proteins, for example, they tend to lower blood pressure. They're great for weight loss. They lower cholesterol levels. These are potential benefits, and in fact, the processing is what makes them beneficial, is because they're concentrating the protein, and the proteins can have these impacts as far as like whether it's weight loss or those other markers. So I don't think that just blanket, suggesting that processed foods are less ideal than whole foods is necessarily true. I think that we can. There are some unique benefits to some of them, but I also don't think I would go so far as to say that people need to consume them. I think it's an option, and certain ones are better than others. I think you can compare even like, for example, tofu, which is processed to whole soy. Well, in whole tofu, you have a greater concentration of protein. You can typically get much more protein per calorie than you would in say, like edamame. And for some people who are eating, a very whole foods diet, it might be difficult for them to get enough calories in if they were to go strictly, super fiber rich as well. So, yeah, I don't generally frame it as like a processed food necessarily being bad. or less
All
healthy.
right, I'm gonna ask you a challenging question, or at least I think it would be challenging,
Yeah.
which is I know that you studied and you got your plant-based nutrition certificate from
Mhm.
Now and the T. Con Campbell Center for Nutrition, um, and what you're saying flies in the face of T. Con Campbell's work. Where does T. Con Campbell get it wrong?
So to be honest, as far as his work specifically, I don't know if he's changed many views. Like, so this was years ago. So going on, what I knew of him from that time, I think some of his views on the protein, like animal protein per se, being problematic, I don't think is well supported. So the reason being is that I think something like the China study, it's a good like kind of opening of a door into further research on this area of the protein and animal protein specifically. And we see very consistently that animal protein rich foods are worse for our health than plant protein rich foods in general, with very few exceptions. However, I would not boil it down to the protein specifically. As we've done more research in that area, it looks like it's the package that it comes in. So when you're looking at animal protein from, say, red meats, it's packaged with saturated fat and heme iron and cholesterol and new 5GC and all these other things that could be having problematic effects. Whereas if we look at isolated animal proteins like whey protein, about the same as isolated plant proteins as far as improving things like blood pressure and whatnot. So I don't think that's necessarily true. I believe he had the position, and I don't know if he still does, that the animal fats weren't that problematic. Maybe you can correct me on that, but I would say they are absolutely
Yeah,
very
so he actually
problematic.
just wrote a book a few years ago,
Okay.
and he hasn't changed his views, and if not, if anything, he's doubled down on it. I would say where he talks about how the saturated fat, the animal fat, really isn't the big thing per se. It is the animal protein, and that it just they happen to travel together. But you can't, you can modify how much fat is in something. You can make a piece of steak more lean, for example, but you can't get rid of the animal protein and still have a piece of steak, right? So,
Okay.
so
Yeah, yeah,
that's why
I
the
can push back
attention
on
has
that.
been drawn from a political perspective or in a commercial perspective to the vilifying of the fats as opposed to what he believes is the real culprit, which is the animal protein itself.
Yeah, so I can push back on that. So for one, we have randomized controlled trials where they're specifically swapping fat source. We're talking things like butter versus plant oils, which excludes the protein. There isn't protein there. And we see that the butter clearly raises heart disease risk relative to the plant fats. And so that's just swapping out the fats. We also have we also have meta-analyses of metabolic ward studies. So these are studies where you have people living in institutions and you control everything that they eat. You can measure everything that, their bloods and whatnot. And you see that very consistently in a dose-dependent manner, saturated fat raises lipids. And we know that LDL cholesterol causes heart disease based on genetic studies, randomized trials, and the like. So we have plenty of research isolating the impact of the fats, and we see that the fats cause those problems. However, when we isolate the proteins in a form of like a whey protein, we don't see that sort of an effect. If anything, we see benefits. So I don't think that there's good evidence for that. Now, I will agree with him that if you look at even lean meats or you look at meat consumption where you adjust for saturated fats, so you're kind of matching up the fat content with the plant foods. Yes, the animal protein sources are typically still associated with worse outcomes, but what else is in there? There's still the cholesterol, there's still the heme iron, there's still the new 5GC. It's lacking the polyphenols and phytonutrients in the plant foods. So even if we do that analysis, we can't say it's the protein per se. There's all this other stuff still in there that is inherent to that product. So I would very much still push back on that idea and say that yes, we know that the animal fats, the saturated fats in particular, are problematic. And it doesn't look like the protein in isolation is necessarily problematic.
So actually, one of the things he does say is that dietary cholesterol does not increase
Hmm.
serum cholesterol.
Okay.
That yeah. So and I'm not, I can't represent T. Con Campbell like T. Con Campbell can.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I haven't even taken his course. I've read all of his books, but so and I'm definitely not a nutritional biochemist. Um, so what do you think about the rat studies that he did with aflatoxin and being able to turn on and off cancer with casein alone?
Hold on. Can I touch on the cholesterol thing really quick?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have, again, we have randomized controlled trials where you modify cholesterol intake, and it does increase LDL cholesterol, but less than saturated fat. So that's key. And it's not a straight line. Like with saturated fat, it's basically the more, the higher it gets. Okay. Whereas with dietary cholesterol, it goes like this. So if you take someone like a vegan who has no cholesterol and you start giving them eggs, it'll shoot up. If you take somebody on a standard American diet and you add more eggs, it doesn't change because there's a maximum amount that it can change. Right.
Right.
So that's one. And then also some people genetically absorb more than others. So genetics play a role there too. But on average, yes, it does have an effect. It's just much smaller. Now, you mentioned rat studies with aflatoxin and whatnot. I would say, again, very interesting, but it's a rat study. Animal research rarely translates to human outcomes. So to give you a number, on average, animal studies translate to clinical practice recommendations in humans with about 5% efficacy. So only 5% of the time, if something occurs in a rodent, it actually ends up being translated into practice for humans because it doesn't pass all those, clinical tests that need to be done before it, eventually moves on to humans.
Why do we use those types of studies?
Yeah, so it's a starting point, right? So now, if something works in, let's say, okay, let's just let me back up for a second. Let's say we didn't test something in animals first and we went straight to humans. It would have less than a 5% chance of working. Okay. Now, if you test something in animals, on average, it has about a 5% chance of working in humans. And then you do small scale human studies, then you move on to slightly larger and then larger. But the biggest concern is harm. If something causes harm in animal models, we're much more concerned about that in humans because we don't want to cause harm. So that's why it somewhat increases the probability of something working in humans, but not to a massive degree. And there are some shifts occurring with like AI and that where we might, eventually down the road not really need the animal studies because they aren't at the end of the day all that effective. But as of right now, that's why they're used. And for medicine and whatnot, it needs to be done. It's a part of the protocol. But I think eventually that might change.
I think a lot of people would be happy if
Yeah.
we didn't
Yeah,
use
I think
animals.
ethically, a lot of people would be for sure.
So you talked about Ozempic.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts about the pros and cons of Ozempic? It seems to become ubiquitous.
Mhm.
It's one thing where you see somebody who is obese and really has some serious medical issues. I see people around me that are, losing like 20, 30 pounds, really for aesthetic purposes. So along that whole spectrum from obese to people who are using it for aesthetic purposes, what do you think are the pros and cons for it?
So for starters, I think it should be reserved for people with clinical obesity who actually need it. I don't think it should necessarily be used for other purposes. Well, I mean, for diabetes as well, but not for like aesthetic purposes specifically. Now, as far as pros, I mean, like I talked about earlier, it really does help. It helps get rid of that food noise. It helps people feel satiated on less. For the first time in many, many years, we're seeing a downtick in obesity rates in the US, and that may be due to the use of these medications. So that's all really positive. However, no, it's not without its concerns. The primary side effects that people experience are gastrointestinal, so things like nausea or abdominal discomfort, constipation. Those are more common, and they can largely be mitigated through slower increases in dosing, for example, or remaining on a lower dose. So there are ways around that, and I think that's just more of an educational piece that needs to sort of be taken. Now, I know a lot of people talk about other concerns, one of them being that people lose muscle mass as well. That happens with weight loss, period. If you have rapid weight loss, even from diet, you end up losing muscle mass. So how that is mitigated is resistance training. I mean, I think that's one of the things is people talk about it like it's just the medication, no lifestyle. I think lifestyle counseling also needs to be given. So you educate people on engaging in resistance training. You educate people on healthier food choices. And this just helps get rid of that sort of noise. Now, I actually made a video on this replying to a video or an interview with Jillian Michaels where she really talked about how, you know, people just need to put in more effort, essentially, for weight loss. And I really do push back on that for reasons I already discussed. I think the big thing is, um, some people are genetically predisposed to having that sort of constant hunger or not being satisfied by their foods or having that food noise. and this levels the playing field. So I liken it to having two people, let's say that they're engaging in a race, a 100-meter race, and one of them is just randomly selected, hey, you have to wear this heavy backpack while you run. And it's random, and so it's quite unfair. Now, and that would be akin to, genetically being predisposed to these thoughts. Now, I would argue that if possible, we should remove that backpack and level the playing field and make it a fair race. They still have to work at it. They still have to run. It's not easy per se, but it gets rid of that extra barrier that they have. While people like Jillian Michaels in this case would say, no, screw it, you just got to work harder, right? And that's how I view those two different perceptions. And so I think it's a great tool for helping level that playing field, giving people the opportunity to actually eat healthier and maintain that. But I strongly believe that nutrition counseling still needs to be given. I don't think you just say, hey, take this and on with your life. I think you talk about how to make healthier choices and engage in exercise to help maintain the muscle mass as well.
So with regards to the loss of muscle, I've heard up to 40% of the weight loss can be muscle loss, and that the people who once they lose that level of muscle, because it's not young people doing it, it tends to be people who are a little bit older, it's muscle mass back on, and then you have all these issues of once you get back up to your normal body mass, now your body mass ratio is much more on the fat side than it previously was, which means that, if muscle burns more than fat, then you now have a lot less muscle to burn calories. So it becomes a spiral, a negative spiral. What are your thoughts on that?
I missed a part of that, but I believe you're asking about if people lose muscle mass, is it a concern that the muscle mass is
Well,
is
I'll
lower
repeat the
and not?
question.
Yeah,
So,
sorry, it just
so
cut out. It cut out
yeah,
while you were
yeah, and I
talking.
apologize. I'll have to after you. I'll have to reset my network. So the loss of okay, so I've heard that up to 40% of the weight loss on these GLP-1 inhibitors can be muscle loss, and that due to the age of people, they are completely unable to put that muscle back on, and when they regain their weight, they're not coming back to the same state that they were in previously. They have a much higher fat to muscle ratio. And given that muscle burns more calories than fat does, these people are in a much worse health position than they were previous to going on the GLP-1 inhibitor.
I see.
What are your
Okay.
thoughts?
Yeah, so the 40% loss, I don't believe that's muscle mass. I believe it's lean mass or fat-free mass. I believe it's one of those measures. So that includes water or bone, et cetera. I mean, it's not going to be necessarily bone loss, but a decent chunk of it could be water loss or fluid loss as well, which happens with weight loss typically, usually in the early stages. So I wouldn't say it's 40% muscle loss per se.
Okay.
Now, that aside, as far as regain, well, if they remain on the medication, which this is a chronic medication for a chronic disease, that shouldn't occur. Now, if somebody goes off, again, there needs to be counseling about throughout and afterwards, the resistance training, the nutrition, and hoping that can be maintained. But generally speaking, the goal is to remain on it, and the rates, at least in the clinical trials of remaining on it, at least say 2 years or so, is pretty high. It's like 80 some odd percent, if I recall.
All right. Well, that went really fast. I really enjoyed our conversation. I appreciate it. I'm definitely sure the studies that you shared with us today, and if you could definitely email us, that'd be great. You can email John's email. I believe that you should
Okay.
have his email. I'm gonna bring these up as points for future conversations. So thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. If we can unmute the audience so they can share their appreciation.
Recommend.
Thank you.
Thank you.